We've got a great session today, which has been brought to you by our partners Productive. We've got Maria and we've got Fran, and Fran's going to be talking about utilization and forecasting in crisis times.
Thanks, Amy, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Fran, and I'm a biz representative at Productive. So, as you can imagine, on a weekly basis, I speak with dozens and dozens of agency owners and managers. So, over the past couple of years, that has added up to hundreds and hundreds of agencies of literally all shapes and sizes that you can imagine. So, as the past year or so has been economically uncertain for agencies, there are some key metrics and figures that agencies still put a later focus on. So that's what we're here to talk about today, and that's utilization and forecasting in crisis times. But just before that, let me quickly tell you about Productive. For those of you who don't know about it, it's an end-to-end agency management tool, and the focus is basically running a more profitable agency. So here you can manage all of your operations, so starting from business development, resource planning, budgeting, billing, project management, time tracking, and finally reporting. Here's what one of our customers actually had to say about it. Basically, the main benefit and what we aim for is having it all in the same place and then having the benefits of having it in the same place. But now let's get on to our KPIs for the day. As a side note, maybe you're already tracking all of these metrics. Maybe you've set up things a little bit differently, and that's all perfectly fine. The point is, every agency is different, but most of the agencies actually face very similar challenges. So please feel free to drop us a comment or a question in the Q&A section, and we'll try to cover everything as we go along. The first point we'll be covering today is, as mentioned, utilization. As I'm sure during turbulent times like these that we're in, agency owners and managers tend to go into some sort of a survival mode. So they want to usually keep a close eye on 5 to 10 financial reports that will give them a pulse on their agency. So what do they focus on? So they focus on profit, on revenue, securing new business, and that's of course all perfectly natural. But financial reports aren't the only thing to track closely when a crisis hits. One of the main assets of any agency is its people, more particularly their capabilities, creativity, and productivity. So utilization is, as you can imagine, super important to look at. I'm sure most of you know and use this basic formula for calculating utilization, so I'm not going to go into it too much. In essence, it's the amount of billable time you can pull out of the total available time of an employee. Here, I would just like to stop for a second and emphasize a few things. Firstly, what does ideal utilization rate look like? And secondly, what certain utilization rates actually can and do indicate. So firstly, what are ideal utilization rates? So basically 70 to 80%. That's an average that we see across many different types of agencies. When we're noticing a constant 90%, that's usually a bit alarming. While over 90% often indicates that your teammates are overworked. So what are the solutions? There are actually a few things. When it comes to the alarming stage, you should start looking into potentially hiring this role or reallocating work to other employees with the same skill sets who are of course available. On the other hand, if there's a longer period of time when you're seeing 90 or even 100%, you can then anticipate teammates will be facing burnout, and that in the long run, as I'm sure you know, you should reconsider workflow and capacity planning. Also, reaching 100% utilization can indicate that there hasn't been enough time to actually invest in people, to invest in things like education, research, or personal development. In times of difficulty, I would say that you would also need to consider keeping your team's workloads as balanced as possible. Otherwise, you as leaders will be battling with managing your team's stress levels or sick leaves. And that will, of course, mess up your capacity planning, or forecasted project deliveries, hiring, and ultimately your cash flow. To really be able to focus on business development and delivering quality service, I would say never forget about your number one asset, and that's your team and their effectiveness. Now, here's something that may come as a surprise. According to one of the most recent agency industry reports by Promethean Research, which included over 45,000 digital agencies since 2015, under 40% of agencies track billable utilization. So under 40%. Because of the scattered data and poorly tracked metrics, it's easy for agencies to outperform each other. And this also leads to chaos and high employee turnover quite often. I have two questions for you, if you would like to share, of course. First would be, do you guys have utilization targets, and what are they? And are they different per employee, per skill? And secondly, are you then monitoring monitoring that utilization rate? And is it different per business unit? Is it different per department or skill? And are you able, or are you even interested in drilling down into these numbers per skill, department, and so on? If anyone would like to share, feel free to go ahead.
We've got one from Dan Bradfield. We have individual utilization aims for different roles, plus an overall aim for the whole team.
And how often do you revise what these targets are?
How often do you revise them, Dan? Revise me.
That's quite often, I would say, from what I've heard from agencies, that they usually revise it yearly or twice per year. That's, I would say, also quite often. It's good to hear that you have different utilization aims for different roles. I think it helps generally.
Got a couple more responses. Tom, is utilization based on what has been billed or what has actually been worked on client work?
There are a couple of different formulas, but generally speaking, agencies tend to look at the amount of billable work in the total worked time. So the more billable work you have out of the total work time, the higher your utilization will be. And then, of course, we can drill down into per role, per department, and so on. So in this case, we don't actually care what has been billed. We would, of course, have separate reports for that. But in this case, we're just interested in seeing what is the utilization, meaning the ratio of billable hours in the total hours that someone has tracked per department, per scale, and so on. Of course, for non-billable employees, that wouldn't be that relevant. Martin said that they aim for 80% utilization for 6 hours a day. Okay, nice. That also makes sense. Do you also track all the non-billable hours? I assume you do, or are you just focused on tracking billable hours? Okay, as expected. Great. Yeah, these are some really good insights. And yeah, I'm glad to hear that you are tracking that. According to the research we share, it's actually not quite that often. And I can tell you that firsthand speaking with agencies.
To answer your question, yes, we do. That's total trackable time in the day of 6 hours. And depending on the employee, some of that will be billable, some of it won't. It depends on their role. But across the organization, that's the standard rate we track.
So you don't have role-specific rates?
Not at the moment, no. Okay. We're only a very small team. But for now, that's what we're trying to get to, is getting everyone. And sometimes it's just practicing getting people to track their time so that we can start measuring and making decisions moving forward. So if we can ask everyone to at least track 80% of their 6 hours of effective time a day, then we can start drilling down into that data.
That makes perfect sense. And I would say as you grow, the need would actually arise for you to drill down into specific department and skill and so on. But I think it's great that you are tracking it overall. And you are then, I assume, comparing actuals versus what the expectation was.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Cool.
And Nelly said, we are aiming to come up with utilization rates for different jobs, seniorities across the team at the moment. Also struggling with getting employees to fill out timesheets consistently for both billable and non-billable time overall.
That's, I would say, a common struggle. What I personally, and I know some of my colleagues as well, try to communicate to leaders, to communicate to their people, is like time tracking is not for you to be monitored. It's not for you to be punished, even though I know sometimes people think it is. It's actually for us to know which jobs are more profitable, which jobs have better results in the end, and we want more jobs that are like these, right? Because ultimately it will be better to employees as well. So that's what we're tracking time for, to see profitability per project primarily, so we know where to focus on. But yeah, there are reminders that you can set in different tools, and of course in Productive. Also, what we've seen some agencies apply, it's a bit more radical, but it actually works quite nicely, is lock timesheets option. So for instance, if employees don't track time for the previous week, at the beginning of the next one, we're locking their timesheets for that previous period. Yeah, constantly pushing people to track time more effectively. You can even create like automated reports and send them out to different channels in case you want people to see who is tracking time. A common struggle, but we definitely suggest tracking time in all cases. Next up, forecasted utilization. So based on my experience, agencies want to know if they have the resources they need available for their upcoming projects. So the questions usually here are, do we have the appropriate skills? Out of those skills, do we have the appropriate seniorities and even departments available to work on those projects that are upcoming? Also, many agencies and many people think that forecasting is just financial. It is, of course, but it's actually much more than that. A few examples. So sales, in many cases, will want to use utilization forecasting to know which services to try to sell more, right? So if we have underutilized skills, we can try to put them to work and essentially sell more of these services. Operations will want to know which teams or teammates can take on more work. And then the evergreen question from the HR, when do we need to start hiring and which roles should we hire and when? Should we do it now or should we do it in 3 months? Should we do it in advance? That's also a question that in the end, I'd like to hear more from you. So how do you guys sometimes manage that because there are various tactics. Are we hiring right away, or do we wait and then hire only when we actually need that resource? Does your agency forecast utilization? At the moment, we have 7 answers and only 2 actually forecast their utilization. So 30%, 29% to be more precise, forecast their utilization as an agency, while 71% don't forecast their utilization. And this was expected, to be honest, and I will show you exactly why. According to the same research I mentioned a few minutes ago, only around 10% out of 45,000 agencies actually track forecast utilization. So we actually have a better result, so congrats. And that's, of course, a very small number of agencies who will look into their future utilization. Thankfully, there are ways to actually track this metric. So what I would quickly like to show you is essentially how agencies leaders that I speak to tend to forecast utilization and plan hiring. But what you can see here on my screen is Productive's resource plan. And essentially on the left side, we would have our available resources. And here we have the actual availability of people and what we call essentially a capacity indicator showing us if a person is underbooked or overbooked. We can, of course, drill down to see the actual project bookings as well as time offs that go into this mix. So how does it usually work? First of all, usually what we would do is we would go into this availability overview. This availability overview shows you some other metrics that you can track in the same screen without having to have 2 tabs open. The first step would be to set the date range of this expected project. So when do we think that this project will run for? And in this case, I've said from beginning of October until the end of December. For this date range, Productive will show me some data. So it would show me available hours, means available to work or in the office, out of those hours, scheduled hours, and the ratio between the two. For bigger teams, what I would suggest is to filter out by resources, right? So you would, of course, be able to tag your resources with different custom fields and then drill down into that specific skill or even that specific seniority that you're looking for. So now we're seeing for this date range skills that we need. And finally, I will just sort this like this so that we see the people with the most available time first. And also I can set my goal so I can colorize my values. So in this case, probably Jessica is the best bet and I can start scheduling her immediately. This here is a virtual placeholder, which you can also use for planning before you know which person will be working on this. That's a brief overview of utilization forecasting. And one other report just to show you for hiring purposes, which we've mentioned under our reporting, which is where we have around 50 pre-built reports. There is a report called Forecasted Billable Utilization by Person. And here we can essentially set again the date range. Here we have our employees and their forecasted billable utilization. And now, if we are looking at specific skills or departments, we can again group by skills. We can add the time component as well, and we can pivot by utilization. So what we see here is essentially green is above our target that we've set, and red is, of course, under the target. And we can now see month by skills, which skills are overutilized in our example based on our target and which are underutilized. And now 2 use cases here. First would be, let's say, hiring. So we can see that CSS in our example is very utilized. So we can probably hire more and we'll probably have enough work to actually assign to these people. On the other hand, content in my example is a bit underutilized. And this can be a good indicator for sales, for instance, right? So let's try to sell more content so that these people actually have more work to do. And then there are various custom fields and reports that you can build out of this. But just as a brief overview of how Productive, for instance, can help you with this, if you're interested in knowing more, of course, feel free to reach out and then we can try to set this up with your examples to see how it worked for you. But yeah, this was a brief overview of that. And now we can continue with our presentation. Last but not least, we will cover revenue, cost, and profit forecasting and budget burn. Now, as we're a bit limited with time here, and there is so much to cover on forecasting, but I thought it might be interesting for us to remind ourselves some of the factors that influence your revenue and your profit forecasting. First question, of course, even though we probably know the answer, why is profitability forecasting important and what factors actually influence profitability forecasting? So obviously the profit and the costs primarily will be affected by the seniorities and cost rates of these people who are allocated per project. So it's very important what the expected margin looks like early on. Why? If you realize that the project might be unprofitable or that you'll go over the budget, after the project is already well underway, you're risking much higher losses. So we want to know this as soon as possible. Here, here, for instance, we're looking at a report which gives us answers to some of the questions that we've mentioned. So here we can monitor our project's expected revenue, cost, profit, and how it all changes through time, month by month. On the next slide, we can see a similar chart. However, this one is focused on the expected budget burn and the time. So you might notice that at the end of the project here, based on the current resources, we're actually expected to go over the budget. Nevertheless, if we go back to the previous slide, you'll see that this project is actually still profitable. In some cases, this might happen as well, and it's also interesting and good to know that it happened and also why it happened. Of course, there's also our revenue, and how and when are we recognizing that revenue? That will also affect this report. There are different preferences when it comes to revenue recognition. Some agencies like to spread out revenue across the entire duration of the project. Some agencies like to recognize revenue on a single date. Generally, from what I know, experts suggest that revenue should be spread out during the course of the project, that it's a better practice than recognizing it on a single date. And we should also, of course, include any other expenses here, right? So we would want to include any expenses we've logged with a future date, whether they're billable or non-billable, of course, and that should be taken into account. And finally, as like the third pillar of costs, so we have already included cost rates or salaries, we have included expenses, and the third thing to include, which is at least suggestion, is to look at your overhead costs. Overhead costs are sneaky, as a colleague of mine once mentioned, and they often get overlooked. Some agencies like to bake that overhead cost in cost rates of people, right? So that it already gets included automatically when people track time. Some like to add expenses on internal projects. So in some cases, of course, something like rent, utilities, these would be your expenses on internal projects. Now, the benefit of adding overheads on top of cost rates is that you'd be able to drill down into net profitability on each project. Because when people track time, you would then be able to see not just the cost rates, but also the overhead included in the effects of those time entries made per project. Other prefer to focus on gross profit margins per project, right? In that case, it might be better if you're interested in gross profit margins, might be better to log expenses against internal projects. But either way, the most important thing is to have those costs included in your P&L reports, right? The overhead costs as well. By the way, another common practice includes doing a scenario analysis before starting a new project, something similar to this. So this could have been our actual resources, but we can use virtual users to actually create a forecast before we start planning, or ideally before we even accept this new project, just to see what will our profit margin look in the end. And I think this would be an amazing profit margin. I'm not sure why this got overlooked, but yeah, this is something you'd be able to see. And after the project is complete, it's wise to compare your actuals with the projected or scheduled metrics, so time and revenue, as well as profitability. The idea is, of course, to get a better sense, a better understanding of what we could have planned or estimated differently, and then hopefully apply those findings to our next project. So maybe we've estimated too many hours. It actually took much less to complete a job, right? Or maybe our scheduled revenue is different than the actual recognized revenue. So it was different than what people have actually delivered or tracked. So that's why it's good always to compare actuals with projections at the end of the project or even during the project. To wrap up, I would just like to leave you again with a few questions, and feel free, of course, to chip in to share how you currently handle this. For those of you that don't do revenue forecasting and utilization forecasting, what is stopping you? Is it just like you not having the time, or maybe you have some other interests, or maybe different approaches to this? What is your utilization for the next quarter? What is your utilization rate? So not just the goal, but do you guys know what the rate would be? Do you know how your profitability changes per time? Is there maybe an issue with business development, landing new projects at the moment? This is something I hear is quite often, unfortunately. Feel free to share your thoughts.
One question here, it says, during some periods when we have a lot of work, our team is over 90%, sometimes even 95% utilized, and in some months they're only 60% utilized. So does that mean we should still consider hiring for those roles?
What we see, of course, it's normal to have periods that are more or less busy. Of course, I'm sure all of you have those periods. One common suggestion, and it's actually quite simple, is to define a time horizon, say 6 months, and then look at those 6 months as a whole. So basically, it's fine if we're less utilized in, say, January, if March makes up for that. And then just look at what will be our average utilization for those 6 months. And let's say it's 75%, that's great. Even though March was 90 and January was 60 or vice versa.
I've been looking into Productive for a while to boost our reporting capabilities. Does this project/budget management tool allow you to track individual budgeted expenses against realized expenses?
Yes, there are different ways to set up your expenses, but we would allow you to budget your expenses and then compare actuals versus the budgeted expenses. And also to see the offset. You can also include them in the forecast analysis that I've mentioned. That would be included in that chart as well.
Okay, and we have one more. How far in advance should we be able to forecast? What's a best practice?
As a rule of thumb, we generally suggest at least 1 quarter whenever possible. Of course, the more you're able to forecast, the better, but I would say 2 forecasts is amazing. I don't think that you need to forecast more than 2 quarters away, but you absolutely can. I know some agencies that do a year in advance, just again for hiring purposes. What they like to do is they like to hire in advance, of course, so they have a couple of months to actually prepare the person for this job. And in that case, the sooner that you would need a specific resource, the better, right? It's up to you, but I would say as a rule of thumb, 1 quarter is a good place to start. How do we approach the subject with hiring new people? Based on forecast, when up until now, it's always been done reactively and often last minute. You can basically start slow, right? So start with scheduling people if you're not already. When you start scheduling, you will immediately be able to see what the forecasted utilizations are. So at one point, hopefully very soon, you will have enough data to say, okay, so now we won't be doing it last minute because we now already see that in 2 months' time or 3 months' time, we are likely to have a new project coming in, right? And we'll need new resources to work on that. But again, the bigger your horizon is for scheduling and for resourcing, the more information and the more in advance you'll be able to know that. Start resourcing and very soon the data will follow because you would be able to then see what is the expected utilization and when will these new projects come up. And based on the resources, you then know where to hire. That would be my suggestion. But you are definitely not the only one. I know many agencies that also do this last minute, unfortunately, but it's easier definitely and better to do it in advance.
Thank you so much for coming today, Fran and Maria from Productive. I think that was really useful and definitely answered a lot of the questions that's been popping off on our Slack recently about utilization and forecasting. Hopefully see you all very soon and have a good week.
Thank you for having us and thank you for asking questions and basically, yeah, nice meeting you all and hope to see you again sometime. And thank you, Amy.